When I rejected the family-arranged marriage, I calmly stated, I have no interest in men. What I like are sweet, soft girls. 3 days later, a girl in a white dress clumsily bumped into me. Her cheeks flushed as she declared, I want to be your woman. Welcome to History channel. Subscribe to follow all our latest adventures. Story begins. A soft, fragrant figure stumbled clumsily into me. Sorry, she exclaimed, lifting her head in a panic. I didn't mean to. Coffee dripped steadily from my coat, pooling at my feet. I looked down at her. Her round cheeks were flushed with embarrassment. She was young, though her poorly applied makeup betrayed her inexperience. Her face and neck were visibly two different shades. The heavy perfume she wore was too strong, clashing awkwardly with her innocent demeanor. She seemed blissfully unaware of her flaws, her expression earnest as she apologized repeatedly. I'm so sorry. Let me clean your coat for you. Could I have your contact information? I'll return it once it's been cleaned. Across from me, my best friend and business partner sat, a mischievous smile playing on her lips as she watched the scene unfold. I couldn't help but think of 2 days ago when I had just rejected Edward Miller's marriage proposal. To be honest, Edward and I were little more than acquaintances before his sudden declaration of intent. A few rounds of golf together had been enough for our families to deem us a perfect match for an arranged marriage. Edward was the textbook heir, molded by his family's expectations. He attended the same schools as his forebears, learned the ropes of the family business, and obediently agreed to a marriage he barely seemed invested in. When he proposed, I saw no point in explaining the world that existed beyond his meticulously planned life. Instead, I simply said I'm sorry. I like girls. I could still picture his shocked expression as I added, soft, fragrant girls. That was 2 days ago. Could news really travel this fast? I handed the girl my contact information. Later, at home, my secretary forwarded me her details. And Johnson. I murmured, scrolling through the information on my phone. She works for our company? The secretary nodded. Yes. She's been with us for 2 years. She only has a high school diploma and used to work in outsourced sales. How did she make it into the marketing department? I asked, raising a brow. Her performance was exceptional. Even as an outsourced salesperson, she was consistently the top performer, often surpassing entire teams. I skimmed through Anne's background. She came from a remote, impoverished mountainous region. She had worked during school breaks just to afford her education. Despite the odds, she was accepted into college but gave up her place to care for her grandmother, the only family member who loved her. At 19, Anne left her hometown with her grandmother, carving out a new life. She should have been promoted this year, my secretary said carefully, gauging my reaction. But your father recommended someone else. I understood immediately. My father's recommendations often aligned suspiciously with his latest interests. Anne's career had stalled. Her accounts were reassigned, her performance dropped, and her income dwindled. Her grandmother was now in the ICU, and medical bills were piling up. So, this was why she had approached me. Interesting, I remarked, setting the file aside. Arrange for her to meet me. And arrived wearing a crisp white blouse and black skirt, her attempt at professionalism undercut by her hastily applied pink lipstick and cloying perfume. She handed me a neatly folded pink bag containing my coat. Miss Smith, she said shyly, I didn't realize it was you. Here's your coat. I'm truly sorry for the trouble. As I took the bag, her hair brushed against my face, and her bare arm grazed my fingers. It's fine, I said, turning back to my work. And hesitated, her gaze fixed on me as if willing me to speak. When I didn't, she bit her lip and finally broke the silence. Miss Smith, I have something to say. I glanced up. Go ahead. My secretary discreetly exited, leaving us alone in the office, and took a deep breath, summoning her courage. Miss Smith, she said, her voice trembling. From the moment I first saw you, I felt something. I like you. I really, really like you. I studied her silently. And I want to be with you, she declared, her hands shaking. I'll do anything. Whatever you want. I regarded her closely. The uneven foundation on her face, the faint wrinkles in her blouse, the cheap pearls dangling by her ears, and the callous tips of her trembling fingers. All of it painted a picture of someone far removed from my world. I let the silence stretch too long. She looked nervous, her eyes searching mine for an answer. "All right," I finally said. Her breath hitched as she realized she had won the gamble. When and Johnson got into my car after work, her posture was strikingly different depending on the audience. Outside, under the astonished gazes of her colleagues, she strode with confidence. But as soon as the car door closed, she shrank into the corner, timid and unsure. "Miss Smith," she asked softly, "where are we going?" Her voice carried a trace of fear, which amused me. Exhausted from the day, I suddenly felt an urge to tease her. "Afraid?" I asked, a sly smile tugging at my lips. "Didn't you say you wanted to be mine? Why the hesitation now?" She swallowed hard, fumbling for an answer. "I like you. I'm just scared. Scared that you don't like me back." I chuckled, said nothing more, and leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes. My thoughts drifted to the plans for my new company. The Smith family businesses were too narrowly focused, and both my father and uncle clung stubbornly to old ways, refusing to embrace innovation. If change was to happen, it would have to be done covertly. The Brown family was no different. My childhood friend Kiki Brown and I had teamed up to start a new venture, but since we avoided leveraging our family names, progress had been slow. Lost in these thoughts, I almost forgot Anne's presence. She was so quiet, she might as well have disappeared. When we arrived at my villa, and eagerly held out her hand to help me out of the car. Her hesitation was brief when our fingers touched, but she quickly regained her composure, leaning toward me slightly as if to close the distance. Inside, she looked up at the grand crystal chandelier and suddenly asked, "Where is everyone?" "Only Aunt Mary is here," I replied, walking toward my bedroom. "She's already asleep." I told her not to wait up, and trailed behind me, her gaze drifting nervously toward the large bed. "So soon," she murmured. Understanding her implication, I couldn't resist teasing her. "What? Are you unwilling?" She bit her lip and steeled herself. "I'm willing. For you, Miss Smith, I'll do anything." "Anything?" I leaned in, staring at her intently. Her shoulders trembled as she nodded. Then, as if summoning her courage, she began unbuttoning her coat. "Wait," I stopped her, picking up my phone. "If you're going to be mine, there are perks." I transferred her a sum equivalent to her average monthly performance back when she wasn't being targeted at work. Enough to cover her grandmother's hospital bills. She glanced at her phone, her hesitation dissolving as she slipped off her coat to reveal a thin camisole. "I really like you, Miss Smith," she stammered. "But it's my first time with a woman. I don't know what to do." She seemed to be convincing herself more than me. "But I like you. I really do." "Whatever you want, Miss Smith, it's fine." I stepped closer, leaning down until my face was near her neck. My breath brushed against her skin as I asked, "Anything at all?" Her body froze, and I saw the fine hairs on her neck stand on end. Anything, she stammered, her voice barely audible. Then, I drew out the word deliberately. "You'll enroll in a Mandarin class tomorrow. Take a month off from work." "I've already arranged it." I stepped back, heading toward the bathroom. "If you want to be mine, you need to meet my standards. For now, you're not there yet." From behind the closed bathroom door, I heard her faint response of agreement. "Sleep in any room downstairs," I added. "And don't come looking for me before 6:30 a.m. I let the water wash over me, my mind returning to work. But in the back of my thoughts, Anne's situation lingered. "And didn't always work in corporate sales," my secretary had said. "She used to sell low-cost products. She's friendly and chatty, which customers liked. But here, dealing with high-level representatives, her background and accent hold her back." The next morning, I woke up at 6:30 as usual and found Aunt Mary fuming in the kitchen, with Anne standing nearby, looking apologetic. Jean," Aunt Mary complained, using the nickname she'd called me since childhood. "This young lady took over my kitchen." I was about to make breakfast when I saw she'd already finished everything. Aunt Mary fussed endlessly about whether the food would suit my taste. She'd raised me and cared only about my preferences. And kept her head low, murmuring, "I'm so sorry." Yet I caught the slight upturn of her lips, a hint of pride she couldn't hide. "It's fine," I said, reassuring Aunt Mary. "I'll eat whatever's served." At breakfast, and sat beside me. "What time did you get up?" I asked. 4, she replied proudly, casting a glance at Aunt Mary. Lowering her voice, she whispered to me, "I made sure to wake up earlier than her. After all, I'm your person." The dishes were simple, with an effort at presentation that fell short of elegance. But the porridge she'd made was rich and fragrant, enough to tempt even Aunt Mary into having a second bowl despite her annoyance. "This porridge is good," I said, giving her a rare compliment. Her eyes lit up. "Of course. I've been cooking since I was 4. My grandmother loves my porridge and says nothing else compares." She began to chatter about her grandmother, her enthusiasm reminiscent of her reputation as a sales champion. But midway through, she stopped abruptly, realizing she might have said too much. I wiped my mouth and stood. "Let's go. Time for work." At the subway station, she stepped out of my Rolls-Royce under the curious gazes of onlookers. Rolling down the window, I said, "I've signed you up for a Mandarin class and arranged a month's leave. Do well." She leaned toward the car, pressing her chest against the window in a pitiful attempt to emphasize what little she had. "Miss Smith, don't worry." She grabbed my hand and in a bold move, tried to press it against her chest. I pulled my hand away, tapping her cheek instead. "If you don't pass, don't bother coming back to me." With that, I rolled up the window and drove off. At a red light, Kiki, who was driving today, glanced at me, her face full of disbelief. "Sister, I sent you some domineering CEO lines yesterday, but I didn't think you'd actually use them. How was it?" I asked. "Dominating enough?" Kiki's expression soured. "They say friends are mirrors. I'm starting to question my own taste." In the days that followed, and Johnson refrained from disturbing me. She diligently attended her Mandarin classes, returning to my villa each evening. Occasionally, she cooked dinner or breakfast, carefully managing her presence to avoid further irritating Aunt Mary. To my surprise, Aunt Mary, who had initially been skeptical, started to mutter the occasional compliment. "That girl isn't too bad," she murmured one evening while arranging flowers. "Made shrimp dumpling soup today. It was quite smooth." I didn't eat shrimp dumplings or anything resembling processed food. My plate held fried shrimp, while Aunt Mary's contained the soup. She avoided fried dishes due to her age, and said nothing about the 2 different meals. Instead, she chatted about her experiences at the training class, regaling us with stories of university life shared by her classmates. The stories weren't particularly interesting, mostly about grades and budding romances, but she recounted them with such enthusiasm that they seemed like tales of a paradise she'd never known. I glanced at her as I ate. Today, she wore a simple t-shirt, shedding the pretense she usually wore as armor. Her unguarded self peeked through, raw and real. 24 years old, I thought to myself. Not so different from those university students. A month passed quickly, and Johnson showed remarkable tact, knowing her boundaries when it came to the topic of being mine. She even struck up an unlikely camaraderie with Aunt Mary. Once a week, she took a day off to visit her grandmother. At the end of the month, I transferred her another sum of money. If I was going to support someone, I intended to do it properly. The day she received the transfer, and seemed torn between joy and unease. "I haven't really done anything yet," she muttered, looking as if she might start undressing again. I stopped her immediately. "This is your base salary," I said firmly. "Once you truly become mine, the pay will increase." Her lack of experience in such matters was evident as she nodded vigorously. "I'll work hard to become Miss Smith's person soon." It was a ludicrously serious conversation, given the suggestive undertone, but we both treated it with a straight face. Today, Kiki wasn't available to drive me, so I planned to make an obligatory visit to my father's office. As I left the villa, I heard her reciting Mandarin loudly from her room. She had told me she wouldn't join me today because she had an exam. I didn't know how well she would perform, but her Mandarin had noticeably improved over the past month. Aunt Mary had mentioned that and was incredibly diligent, waking early and staying up late to study. Regardless of the results, she had given it her all. As I considered how to encourage her if she failed, I reminded myself that Anne wasn't someone who needed much prodding. After her exam, she returned to work for another month. I, meanwhile, dealt with clashes at my father's office that left me mentally and physically drained. When I finally returned home, Anne greeted me at the door, her face alight with excitement. "I passed," she whispered conspiratorially, as if afraid to frighten her own success away. Her naive pride made me laugh. Unbothered, she continued eagerly, "I've always wanted to take this test, but I never had the time." I knew why she hadn't had the time. No money, no freedom, and the responsibility of caring for her ailing grandmother. Every moment had been dedicated to survival. "This is my first certificate," she said, clutching it like a treasure. I cleared my throat. "Since you passed, it's time to follow through on our agreement." I tossed my jacket onto the sofa, startling her. She hesitated but quickly composed herself, a mix of nervousness and determination on her face. "Why yes," she stammered. "I did it for you, Miss Smith, so I could be your person." Her words faltered, and she, like me, began unbuttoning her shirt. Before I could stop her, she had stripped down to her bra. "Let's do this," she said with the resolve of someone marching to their doom. At that moment, Aunt Mary descended from the second floor, walking past us without so much as a glance. Both Anne and I froze. Panicking, I grabbed my phone and quickly transferred her a larger sum. "This is your raise," I said hastily. "You started with a base salary, and now that you've met one of my requirements, you've earned a bonus." Anne looked flustered. "Ha!" I fled upstairs, but not before catching a glimpse of her wandering aimlessly, still in her bra, pretending to busy herself. Aunt Mary, ever composed, picked up Anne's discarded shirt and tossed it onto the sofa as she passed by. Anne and I both retreated in embarrassment, like children caught in mischief. I am, as Kiki Brown often reminds me, a classic domineering CEO. Kiki, with her eclectic taste in books, oscillates between cutting-edge research papers on finance and the quirks of bizarre romance novels. "A domineering CEO must act like one," she declared. "And a true CEO wouldn't simply decide to sleep with Anne Johnson just because she passed a Mandarin exam." "I have other standards," I said, sitting upright in my chair with practiced gravitas. "I can't stand a woman who hasn't mastered a second language. Imagine sharing my bed with someone who can't even speak a foreign tongue." I paused, realizing that Kiki's suggested script was a bit too harsh, but Anne was listening intently. At the mention of foreign language, her head drooped, and her once spirited demeanor crumbled. The determined young woman shrank into a shadow of herself. Knowing I needed to push her just enough, I steeled myself and delivered the final blow from Kiki's script. "Frankly, it disgusts me." Her head sank even lower. "But I've never learned a foreign language," she murmured. I already knew. My secretary had told me she had missed countless opportunities because of it. Her lack of linguistic skills wasn't her fault. Her background and circumstances had left no room for such luxuries. But if she wanted to rise, this was an obstacle she couldn't avoid. "You have 2 years," I said, locking eyes with her. "I'll hire the best tutors and give you all the time you need. Your job is simple. Become someone worthy of me." She raised her head slowly, determination flickering back into her eyes. "I will," she said with quiet resolve. "I'll work hard to become Ms. Smith's person." I enrolled her in not only a foreign language course but also classes in makeup and etiquette. The balance of study and refinement wasn't overly taxing. Anne's progress in language learning was slow, expected for a beginner, but her improvement in makeup was immediate. 2 weeks in, her foundation was perfectly matched. Her lashes curled gracefully without the clumpy fly legs from before. One evening, as she set the table for dinner, I found myself pausing to admire her refined appearance. "Does it look good?" she asked, noticing my gaze. My teacher pointed out my mistakes, and I've corrected them. My eyes drifted to her ears, now free of the plastic faux pearls. Exhausted from a contentious day spent arguing with my father over my new company with Kiki, I had no energy for words and used my gaze to inquire about the change. And smiled sheepishly. The teacher was right. She said not to wear obvious fake jewelry. People with discerning eyes can always tell. And of course you noticed. It was a subtle compliment, one that made me chuckle. And however, carried no shame about her previous mistakes. She radiated an earnest pride in her growth, a confidence that said, I'm improving every day. Her energy steadied me. Go to Shine Jewelry this weekend, I said. Pick out a pair of pearl earrings and a necklace to match. It's my friend's store. Just give them my name. She looked up, surprised. Why are you giving me a gift? Why indeed? I couldn't admit it was a token of gratitude for soothing my frustrations. Instead, I said, to celebrate the progress in our relationship. And blinked, startled by the statement. But Aunt Mary's stern approach silenced any further questions. That weekend, I called Edward Miller. Shine Jewelry was part of his family's empire, and he was currently managing the store as part of his training to take over the business. By Sunday afternoon, Edward called back. I thought you were joking, he said with a heavy sigh. Until the girl actually showed up. He hesitated before continuing, clearly unsure how to refer to Anne. My woman, I supplied smoothly. Uncomfortable discussing my woman with me, Edward quickly shifted topics. She's a decent girl, he said. Good taste too. Picked simple earrings and a necklace that suit her style. Then after a pause he added, but she's not exactly the soft and sweet type you mentioned before. She seems capable. Preferences evolve, I replied. This is what I like now. Edward went silent for a moment. Eventually, he spoke again. I called to tell you she did mention your name to pick the earrings and necklace. But she also bought some extra items and paid for them herself. What items? I asked. My guess? A surprise for you. He chuckled. She's clearly very fond of you. Not wanting to engage further, I dismissed him curtly. If it's a surprise, you shouldn't be spoiling it now. Edward huffed. Exasperated. It's a good thing we didn't end up marrying. After hanging up, I couldn't help but feel some satisfaction for Edward. He seemed to be shedding his dull, predictable self. Sending Anne to Edward's store had been a calculated move. My father was once again pushing for an arranged marriage, still convinced Edward was a suitable match. He didn't care about my preferences, but I figured this would help Edward give up entirely. I rubbed my temples, realizing I was embodying Kiki's domineering CEO persona more and more. But unlike the novels, where women fought over the CEO, I had sent my woman to meet the man my father wished for me to marry. That evening, Anne Johnson surprised me with a gift. With great care, she presented a small box. I picked this out for you, she said solemnly. I think it suits you. Then in a smaller voice she added, there was something better, but it was too expensive for me to afford. I opened the box to find a pearl hairpin. For Anne, spending several thousand yuan was a significant gesture. She still tied her hair with 5-cent elastic bands, yet she had bought me something far beyond her means. This is also something I learned in the training class, she explained softly. When giving gifts to someone who already has everything, it's best to choose something beautiful and extravagant. Something they don't need but would still appreciate. Her voice faltered. I actually wanted to get you a brooch or something more meaningful. But at this price, it would seem cheap for someone like you. She hesitated, then broached a subject she had carefully avoided until now. The money you've given me. It's a lot. And I still earn my salary from the company. But my grandmother's condition is worsening. She's the only person who's ever cared for me. I want her to have a private room and the best treatment. Her grandmother was old, far too ill to make a real recovery. The treatment she insisted on could only ease her pain, not cure her. I just paid for next month's hospital fees. This was all I had left. I looked at the hairpin. By conventional standards, it was one of the cheapest gifts I'd ever received. But in its own way it was the most valuable, because it represented everything she had. It truly is a surprise, I murmured. Time passed quickly. The company Kiki and I started faced numerous obstacles, but we overcame them all. Meanwhile, Anne immersed herself in her studies. At first, it was basic vocabulary, then hesitant sentences, and eventually, she progressed to reading short passages aloud. Now, she was even tackling fairy tales. Fairy tales have simpler vocabulary, she said with newfound confidence. I'll start small, but someday I'll be able to read industry reports in English. She even started to joke. Miss Smith, should I read you a bedtime story tonight? Her cheerfulness was almost infectious. Despite my lack of interest in fairy tales, I found myself nodding. All right. We both froze, startled by my response. A moment passed, and we pretended nothing had happened, each returning to our tasks. Later that night, as I emerged from the shower wrapped in a towel, there was a knock at my bedroom door. And stood there in her pajamas, holding a book. What are you doing here? I asked, frowning. You said I could read to you. She replied, her voice barely above a whisper. For reasons I couldn't explain, I felt a pang of nervousness. This was my fault, after all. And seemed to notice my hesitation. Emboldened, she stepped into the room with a triumphant air, walking straight to my bed. We sat stiffly side by side as she began reading Cinderella. I recognized it as the same story she'd practiced earlier that afternoon. Then, her reading had been slow but fluid. Now, she stumbled over the words, distracted. She looked different too. After taking a course on style, her wardrobe had undergone a complete transformation. Even her pajamas were elegant, the fabric soft and luxurious. But as she sat on the bed, her nightdress rode up slightly, revealing more than she likely intended. When I reached for my water glass, our thighs brushed against each other. Her voice faltered, and my hand froze mid-reach. The atmosphere grew thick with awkward tension. Why wasn't she leaving? I wondered. But I couldn't bring myself to ask her to go. When I glanced at her, I realized she was just as uncertain as I was. The room was silent until a sudden knock at the door startled us both. Aunt Mary, and blurted, leaping from the bed as if saved. I'll go see what she needs. She fled the room, and I collapsed back onto the bed with a long exhale. How do you handle being with a woman? Honestly, I didn't know. The days blurred together. Kiki and I navigated countless challenges with our company, and faced hurdles in her language studies, but like us, she found solutions to every problem. Kiki and I both clashed with our families. My father's fury culminated in my uncle smashing a glass, and I ended up severing ties with nearly everyone. Kiki's situation was slightly better. At least her mother secretly supported us, even providing financial help during tough times. Now our company was thriving. And too, had completed her etiquette and makeup courses. She moved with elegance, her style polished and appropriate. At the moment, she was sorting through negotiation materials for me, her sleeves rolled up. This one's from the foreign company, she said, opening a file. The offer isn't great. Her language skills had improved to the point where she could confidently read industry reports. Her background in sales also gave her an intuitive understanding of costs, making her insights invaluable. This American company's quote is better, fairer, she added, waving another document. Good, I said, massaging my temples. You'll come with me to next week's negotiation. She looked surprised but quickly agreed. It'll be my first English negotiation, she admitted, a hint of nervousness in her tone. I'm not sure how much help I'll be. Don't worry, I reassured her. Consider it a learning experience. In truth, she underestimated herself. During the meeting, I gave her subtle cues to speak up during simple exchanges. At first, her voice was hesitant, but as the negotiation progressed, she gained confidence. By the end, she was contributing key points that bolstered our position. And Johnson wasn't just keeping up. She was thriving. She had become a better version of herself. I officially hired her. And Johnson resigned from my father's company and joined mine. Though I still provided her with support money, she had moved from the safety of a large corporation to my fledgling enterprise. Every day, she accompanied me to factories, overseeing production lines. Covered in dust and grime, we would exchange amused glances, unable to suppress our laughter. You didn't tell me being yours would be this hard, she said one day, handing me a bottle of water after twisting the cap open. You said you'd do anything, I countered, meeting her gaze. Glancing around to ensure no one was nearby, she leaned closer, lowering her voice. I did say that, but... Her voice dropped even further. Her words almost a whisper. But I was talking about... In bed. My hand jerked, nearly spilling the water. She was growing bolder, something I appreciated, but there were still limits to such provocations. Clearing my throat, I straightened my posture. I seem to recall you once saying you didn't know how to do anything. That was before, Miss Smith. She smiled mischievously. You've praised me as a quick learner, haven't you? I've read some books, watched some movies. She winked. I've learned a lot. I avoided her gaze, focusing instead on my water. Really, she added, leaning in closer, her voice soft and suggestive. I've learned quite well. Before I could respond, the engineering manager approached, wiping sweat from his brow. Miss Smith, he reported, we'll finish loading the goods today and ship them out tomorrow. After delivering his update, he glanced at Anne. And, what have you been learning so well? Did we get a new order? Should I study it too? This time, it was Anne who fell silent. And Johnson truly was extraordinary. I gave her 4 years to grow, and she surpassed every expectation. At first, she simply accompanied me to negotiations, observing. Then she began taking the lead, managing clients and deals on her own. Her attention to detail, combined with a knack for balancing firmness and charm, allowed her to secure a client even Kiki Brown had failed to close. When Kiki returned from her overseas assignments and saw Anne's progress, she was stunned. All these clients? Kiki asked. And handled them all? Anne nodded modestly. Kiki leaned close to me, whispering, You have a great eye for talent. I couldn't disagree. And Johnson had brought in profits that far exceeded the cost of hiring her. The company was thriving. We no longer needed to chase new clients, and even my father, though still disapproving of my choices, had begun to speak to me with a mix of caution and respect, and had taken on the role of marketing director, a position she had once dreamed of in my father's company. Her reputation grew, attracting headhunters who tried to lure her away. I ensured her salary remained highly competitive. One evening, as we drove home together, she spoke up. My salary is high enough now, she said. You don't need to send me any more money. She was referring to the support money. But she deserved every cent. Without her, the company wouldn't have achieved this level of success. It's what you've earned, I replied. But... She blinked playfully, her eyes gleaming with mischief. We're true love, aren't we? True love doesn't need money as proof. I had no answer for that. Closing my eyes, I feigned sleep. Life was good. The company was flourishing, and Anne Johnson was thriving. One weekend, I accompanied her to visit her grandmother in the hospital. Her grandmother lay on the bed, frail and unmoving. The patient's lucid moments are becoming less frequent, the nurse explained apologetically. Her condition will only worsen from here. There's nothing more medicine can do. And stood quietly by my side, listening without interrupting. After the nurse finished, Anne nodded and stepped into the room. The nurse sighed with relief, turning to me. You must be her friend. It's good you're here. She's never been willing to hear this from us before. I followed and inside and sat beside her as she held her grandmother's hand. Grandma, I'm here, she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. She began recounting her week, telling stories of deals she had closed and her growing reputation in the company. She spoke with pride, sharing how everyone admired her. I sat silently, listening. At last, her voice broke. Grandma, don't worry about me. For the first time, she seemed to accept the inevitable, no longer clinging to the hope of a miracle. I'm doing well now, she said, her tone thick with tears. I know you're worried about me, and I know you're in pain. But I can't let go of you. Her voice cracked as she began to sob. You're all I have. Her hand tightened around her grandmother's frail fingers. But now, you don't have to worry anymore. She reached out, taking my hand and placing it over her own, wrapping her grandmother's hand between ours. I have someone with me now, she whispered, her head bowed, tears streaming down her face. I've met someone wonderful. Her voice trembled. She's made me into someone wonderful too. Grandma, if... She choked back a sob. If it hurts too much, you don't have to hold on anymore. Your granddaughter can live well on her own now. Her grandmother didn't open her eyes. Her wrinkled, weathered face remained still, peacefully asleep. I held the elder woman's frail hand as tears fell silently onto the floor. The weight of Anne's sorrow pressed heavily on my chest, tightening around my heart. I tightened my grip, lightly squeezing the thin hand I held. A faint, almost imperceptible strength responded. The corners of her grandmother's lips lifted in the faintest of smiles. I pulled some strings to enroll in Johnson in an elite university's MBA program. Does this mean the company doesn't need me anymore? She asked, her tone tinged with suspicion. The schedule isn't too demanding, I reassured her. If the company needs you, we'll let you know. She didn't seem entirely convinced. But aren't you planning to take the company public? I want to help. I broke it down for her, piece by piece. While you're attending classes, focus on networking. Your classmates will be future connections. You've never been to college, and that's always been a weak point. An MBA will give you credibility. As for the IPO, Kiki Brown is already working with the professionals. We can afford to take it easy on this front. Reluctantly, and relaxed. Fine. But I'll still come home every day to cook for you. That's unnecessary, I replied. Your studies are the priority. I might not even be home for dinner most nights. She eyed me suspiciously. Why does it feel like you're hiding something from me? Wearing a chic tweed suit and crimson heels that elevated her height, her makeup flawless with a faintly winged eyeliner, she exuded a commanding aura. I couldn't meet her gaze. Her suspicion deepened. What's really going on? Her eyes widened suddenly, and she blurted, You're not seeing someone else, are you? I felt like an accused husband frantically explaining his innocence. You're with me all day at the office, and I don't go out after work. You know that. But Anne wasn't the composed, business-savvy woman in that moment. She was a 28-year-old woman venting her frustrations. I didn't have the time or patience to argue. Work was piling up, and I needed to stay late to handle it. Finally, I snapped. I haven't even fully claimed you yet. How could I possibly have someone else? Her expression shifted as though she had uncovered a grand secret. I knew it, she declared triumphantly. That explains everything. She leaned closer, her tone suddenly playful. Come home early tonight. I've been ready for a while. Kiki sent me lots of helpful resources. Before I could respond, my secretary knocked and entered the room, ending the conversation, and left with the secretary to arrange work in the marketing department, leaving me alone in the office. Staring at the project proposal in front of me, my irritation boiled over, and I slammed my hand on the desk. Kiki Brown, I muttered angrily. No wonder you haven't dared to come back this year. Despite my hesitation, I eventually returned home that night. As expected, and Johnson was prepared. I stalled, lingering over dinner, taking an inordinately long shower. But when I finally stepped out of the bathroom, there she was, sitting on my bed with a book in her hands. What story do you want to hear tonight? She asked, as though this were a nightly routine. I almost retreated back into the bathroom. Don't act like you've been reading me bedtime stories for years, I chided. You came once, 3 years ago, when you were learning a foreign language. And you didn't even finish Cinderella. If this had been the old Anne Johnson, she would have blushed furiously. But this Anne was unfazed, even confident. Are you complaining about me? She asked, setting the book aside. Her hand brushed the hem of her skirt, lifting it slightly. My eyes caught on the curve of her strong, slender legs. She shifted, revealing the lace-edged pink fabric of her thigh-highs. My heart pounded, a dizzying thrum that left me light-headed. For once, Aunt Mary was nowhere to be found, leaving me to fend for myself. I'm not ready, I stammered. Oh. And tilted her head, her voice steady and calm. But I've been ready for a long, long time. These things take planning, I said, fumbling for an excuse. We should pick the right day. Why not today, she said firmly. Today seems perfect. Somehow, our roles had reversed. I was the flustered one now, while she radiated poise and confidence. She slid off the bed and approached me, her soft-soled slippers making her seem shorter than usual. She stopped mere inches away, looking up at me with unwavering intensity. "I put on the coral pink lipstick you like," she said softly. "And your favorite perfume. I wore the fabric you said you liked. And I even bought those little accessories Kiki recommended." Her voice dropped to a whisper, warm and inviting. "So tell me, what's there not to like?" Her gaze burned, making it impossible for me to look her in the eye. I turned my head away in a weak attempt to escape. 6 months, I blurted. 6 months from now, after the IPO, I'll give you a surprise. She studied me for a moment, then stepped back, giving me room to breathe. 6 months, she said, her tone serious. I hope it's a surprise I'll like. The team Kiki Brown hired was highly experienced, and we quickly prepared for the IPO. When news of the impending listing broke, my father summoned me home. We didn't speak of the past. Instead, I found myself sitting between my father and uncle, who praised me with smiles and compliments, calling me the most outstanding member of the younger generation. Taking advantage of the moment, I secured several valuable resources from my father. Kiki still refused to come home, though her mother basked in pride, her laughter the loudest wherever she went. Before the IPO, Kiki and I discussed several arrangements, and she agreed to my proposals. On the big day, I invited Ann Johnson to join us on stage. Her surprise was evident, though she quickly masked it with composure, following me and Kiki as we stepped onto the platform. Together, the three of us held the gavel and struck the bell. Anne's expression was a mix of wonder and disbelief. She could never have imagined that a girl from a remote mountain village would one day stand on the Nasdaq stage. That evening, at the celebratory gala, I mingled with the guests, raising glasses and exchanging pleasantries. It wasn't until late into the event that I finally caught a break. And approached me quietly, holding a glass of water. Taking it from her, I sipped to soothe my throat. We stood on the balcony, the cool night breeze brushing past us. "Was inviting me on stage the surprise you mentioned?" she asked softly. I shook my head. "Just part of it." Taking her to a nearby room, I retrieved a thick file from a safe. "This," I said, handing her the documents, "is the real surprise." She opened the file, her face quickly filling with shock. "Though the company was founded by me and Kiki, your contributions have been immense," I explained, sliding the file toward her. "These shares are what you deserve." I watched her carefully. With these shares, she would have financial independence. She had everything now. Fluent language skills, elegant demeanor, a nearly completed MBA from a top university. She was wealthy, beautiful, and most importantly, young, with limitless potential ahead of her. She shouldn't just be my woman. The surprise on her face was fleeting. She looked up at me and asked, "Is there more?" I shook my head. "No." Disappointment clouded her expression. "But you know, this isn't the surprise I wanted." Taking a deep breath, I said, "There's a truth I've never told you. I've never liked women." Her eyes widened, but I pressed on. "When I agreed to keep you, it wasn't out of affection. I was struggling, and so were you. I wanted to see how far I could go, and how far you could go. Now we've both reached our goals. I enrolled you in the MBA program so you could find someone you truly like." I hesitated before adding, "I know you don't like women either. Back then you had no other choice." And studied me, her gaze sharp. "So you've arranged my next steps, haven't you?" She let out a sudden laugh, the sound sharp and almost startling. "You're right. I didn't like women back then. But if I had to depend on someone to survive, I preferred it to be a woman. That's why I chose you. But now," she continued, her eyes boring into mine, "I'm certain of one thing. I don't love women, and I don't love men. I love you." Her words caught me off guard, shattering my carefully constructed narrative. "Do you like men?" she asked suddenly. I nodded. "Yes." "How do you know?" "I had a crush on a senior in school," I lied, and burst out laughing, her laughter uncontrollable and breathless. It took her a long moment to recover. "You're lying." Her certainty was unnerving. It's true, I insisted weakly. She gave me a calm, knowing look. Really? Because Kiki told me you were so focused on studying in school that you barely spoke to anyone, let alone had a crush. Closing my eyes, I silently cursed Kiki Brown. So you're lying, and said plainly. You've arranged my future perfectly, ensuring I'll live well. You even lied about liking men instead of simply telling me you don't like me. So, she asked, are you still sure you don't like me? I had never seriously considered love or relationships. I had always assumed I was straight, simply because I hadn't met a man I liked yet. Now, faced with her directness, I didn't know how to respond. And leaned in, her confidence unwavering. You like me. She had no intention of leaving. And I had no effective way to make her go. So, we carried on as we had before. But she became bolder, often appearing in my bedroom uninvited. At first, Aunt Mary would cough loudly in disapproval. Eventually, even Aunt Mary stopped commenting. By the third day of the second month, and was openly sleeping in my bed. I resorted to grabbing another blanket and sleeping elsewhere. By the 15th day, she kissed me on the cheek as I pretended to sleep. By the 6th day of the third month, she held my hand under the covers. By the 4th month, after a particularly frustrating day, I drank too much with Kiki. In my drunken state, Kiki called in to pick me up. The next morning, I found myself lying in bed, stunned by the realization. Being with a woman wasn't bad. By April 3rd of the 5th year, and was up early, making porridge. Aunt Mary, long accustomed to her presence, had 2 bowls before heading out for a walk. I lounged in my chair, lazily flipping through the paper, and brought over a bowl of porridge. News about the second company's IPO leaked? I nodded. It won't affect the process. And the rumors about your orientation? Everyone knows you're keeping a woman now, she teased, brushing her hand under my chin. Though older than her, I couldn't help feeling flustered whenever she teased me like this. I'm not gay, I retorted. Oh, she drawled, her tone teasing. That's not what you said last night. Blushing furiously, I fell silent. But deep down, I argued with myself. I still believed I was straight. It's just that, before the man I might love could appear, the woman I would love had already arrived. And so, this is how we would live, long, steady, and together. The end. Thanks for stopping by. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any new videos.